This series explores games from the role-playing hobby's history, examining their pros and cons and taking a look at what can be recommended if you wish to give a game a go. Today we're going to look at 3 iterations of the Traveller science fiction role-playing game, or rather 3 role-playing game systems that license the background and some elements of the Traveller game to use alongside other rule foundations. This is what I term the Traveller Interregnum, that long night between the 4th edition of the game, also known as Mark Millar's Traveller, and the current era of its 5th edition, or T5, and Mongoose Publishing's revitalisation of the game. That is, the 1998 to 2008 period, which brought GURPS Traveller, Traveller 20 or T20, and Hero Traveller. When Imperium Games closed its doors in 1998, see my video on Mark Millar's Traveller, link in the description, it looked like dark times were on the horizon for the Traveller game. Mark Millar himself had promised a 5th edition that was in the works, with an interdeterminate time frame. So all we really had to keep our Traveller spirits alive were spaces such as citizens of the Imperium. Basically, each other. Lauren Wiseman, however, and trust me, there are very few people that have walked this planet that have contributed more to Traveller than Lauren, may he rest in peace, had other plans. After GDW closed, see my videos on Mark Millar's Traveller and Traveller the New Era, Lauren eventually found his way to Steve Jackson Games. Purveyors of Car Wars, Ogre, Munchkin and, more important to our essay du jour, GURPS, Generic Universal Role-Playing System. Just rolls off the tongue. Anyway, Steve Jackson Games entered into a licensing agreement with Far Future Enterprises, basically Mark Millar, to use Traveller content within the GURPS framework. In 1998, the result of this, written by Lauren Wiseman, became GURPS Traveller. This was the first of a trend for the Interregnum, that is, pick up the broad concepts of the Traveller background, basically the Third Imperium setting, adapt an existing set of rules to depict, in its own fashion, the careers of the Traveller game, and port in those elements of the Traveller system that could be made to work within that set of rules, either to fill in gaps required for Traveller-esque play, or to make the play feel somewhat like Traveller, or both. Essentially, what we had here was a depiction of the Third Imperium setting, charted space, within a GURPS setting book. GURPS Traveller did one more radical thing, though, and that was to introduce an alternate reality to charted space. Most of the iterations of Traveller up to this point are set within a historical framework, either progressing that framework, as in Classic, Mega Traveller and New Era, or exploring a different past era, as in Traveller 4. Now we had another official concept to play with. The GURPS Traveller extension of the Classic period, where the rebellion of Mega Traveller never happened. This wasn't particularly radical from a gamer perspective. Most of us diverge from the absolute canon of charted space in one way or another, even ignoring it completely. But we hadn't had an extensively supported parallel alternative before. It was a pretty cool idea. It also helped that some of the books released for GURPS Traveller are absolutely fantastic and worthwhile additions to any Traveller's shelf, regardless of preferred edition. For me, First In and Far Trader are permanent parts of my working Traveller library, for example. GURPS Traveller was, I think, a good move for Steve Jackson Games too. I, for one, would have probably never picked up a GURPS book without it, and I bet I'm not the only one. GURPS was, for me, always one of those games that looked okay on the game shop's shelf, but never good enough to pick up and buy. With GURPS Traveller, I only picked up some of the core GURPS books. The core rulebook, GURPS Space, High-Tech, Low-Tech, Ultra-Tech and Vehicles, in order to understand the GURPS-specific concepts presented in GURPS Traveller. But that led me to be impressed enough as to bring other GURPS books covering subjects interesting to me into my library, Celts, Egypt and so on. You don't really need to play GURPS to make use of GURPS source books. GURPS Traveller ran through to 2008, with a second edition in 2006, GURPS Traveller Interstellar Wars, for the 4th edition of GURPS. Interstellar Wars was a departure from the established alternate parallel of GURPS Traveller, opting instead to explore the setting first described in the Imperium game, That See My Classic Traveller video sort of kicked the whole Traveller thing off in the first place. The setting here is the common historical point in both core and GURPS Traveller canon, where the First Imperium of the Volani and the Terran Confederation of the Solomani clashed. The idea was nice, but for some reason it felt as if some of the wind had gone out of the GURPS Traveller sails. So let's wind back a handful of years, from the end of GURPS Traveller's run to the year 2000, a seminal point in the history of role-playing. It was during this year that Wizards of the Coast finally published their own iteration of Dungeons & Dragons, having purchased the property with a dying TSR in 1997. One of the things that Wizards of the Coast had learned from their observation of TSR was that rulebooks sell, but adventures and campaign setting books generally don't, at least not to the same scale. They also felt that TSR and the Dungeons & Dragons brand had gathered some level of bad reputation for being protective and litigious. Companies such as Mayfair and GDW had all come under fire from TSR in the past. To resolve both of these issues, Wizards, through Ryan Dancy, came up with an open game license that gave a third-party publishers breathing space to produce materials based on Dungeons & Dragons, thus solving the first issue, in that Wizards didn't really need to support the new D&D edition through adventures and settings too much, as that slack could be taken up by third parties, while basically promising not to be so ready with the lawyers, as had been the case previously, thus gaining some brownie points and non-litigious reputation. Okay, at the time of this writing in January 2023, there's some whole other stuff going on, but our little selves here back in 2000, where things were a lot friendlier. Enter QuickLink Interactive. QuickLink was originally set up to produce a software package called GRIP, G-R-I-P, from Generic Role-Playing for Internet Players. Basically something of a forerunner to the virtual tabletops that we have today. QuickLink were granted a license to cover Traveller with GRIP, and also to take advantage of the aforementioned open gaming license. See, there was a point to all of that particular ramble about Dungeons & Dragons. To produce a D20 version of the Traveller game. Now, this arrived in 2002 in the shape of the Traveller's Handbook, which outlined Traveller D20, or T20 for short. The game set itself within the classic era of the Traveller timeline, but gave special focus to the training edge of the Imperium, particularly through the Gateway to Destiny sourcebook. In fact, much to my joy, since this is my own favourite playground of the official Traveller universe. QuickLink were very active for just under 4 years, and managed to pack a lot of Traveller in that time. This took the shape of a number of products: supplemental Traveller's Aids, a series of 7 adventures set in the classic era that followed the epic EPIC, easy playable interactive checklist structure, but also laying out the foundation for a lot of things many current Traveller players find vitally useful today, such as the Traveller Wiki. That Traveller is still with us, and as reasonably well supported as it is today, is at least partially due to the efforts of Hunter Gordon and Martin J. Dougherty during the relatively short span of T20. Hunter Gordon, unfortunately, is also no longer with us. The last of the non-Traveller versions of Traveller to be released was Traveller Hero, a variant that brought the Hero system role-playing rules, published by Hero Games, itself developed from the superhero game Champions, which we will eventually get to in this series, to the Traveller universe. Arriving in 2007 from Comstar Games and structured around the Star Hero genre book for the 5th edition of the Hero system, Traveller Hero attempted a treatment that spanned all known eras of Traveller, including Comstar's own 1248 era, written by Martin J. Dougherty, and published by Comstar for under the T20 banner, although the 1248 sourcebooks are really system agnostic in content. Traveller Hero was only released in PDF and was very short-lived. A number of supplements were released for it, mainly focusing on constructions, starships, robots, and so on. A final mention must be made to the ultimate keeper of the flame of the Traveller game, Mark Miller. During this entire interregnum, he was at the heart, keeping things alive through licensing Traveller to all of the companies that we've mentioned here, but also in making the classic rules available again through the collected works from 2000. The classic books, supplements, adventures, double adventures, games, alien modules and JTAS, while gradually working on the beast that was to come. Each individual game plays in its own unique way, and it is beyond the scope of this particular video to delve into the 3 variants covered. But in short summary, GURPS is a generic rule set that builds its flexibility on relatively simple core concepts. It is a point-buy system using archetypes and templates to describe careers, or whatever specific setting subject needs that parallels a career, and species. It is perhaps the best suited to emulation of Traveller play of the 3 that we have covered here, but necessarily omits elements that, to my mind, make the Traveller experience unique, particularly with respect to character generation. The D20 system is constructed from the core rules of 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, and as such, all of the familiar elements of the D&D brand of gaming, levels, classes, armour classes and so on. The D20 model does work, in certain ways, to provide a heroic style of play within a science fiction base, as can be viewed within D20 Modern, D20 Future and D20 Star Wars, and obviously D20 Traveller. However, for me, level-based games by their very nature possess an assumption of progressive power that does not fit well in the Traveller experience. The hero system is a monster, literally. It has used promotion in the past, highlighting how the core rulebooks are, due to page count, pretty much bulletproof. It is a point-buy system that is very extensive and expansive, and that makes almost every aspect of it overly complex and slow. It works when focused, such as it is within some of the setting books and games built from it, including Traveller Hero and Champions. But when taken as an entirety, it is way too convoluted. At the time of this video, Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition has been covered on this channel, and GURPS and Champions will be covered at a later point. Hero, maybe. For Traveller T20, the only core essential is the core rulebook, which also requires the Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition Player's Handbook. Note not the 3.5 edition, as T20 predates that iteration of Dungeons & Dragons. To this, I would add Gateway to Destiny, partially because it's an excellent sourcebook, partially because I'm biased towards that area of the Traveller universe, and particularly because it gives T20 referees a good template from which to work their own Traveller universes or campaign areas out. For GURPS Traveller, either the GURPS Traveller or Interstellar Wars books will give you the Traveller core, but you will also need the relevant GURPS core book to make proper use of them. For GURPS Traveller, this is the GURPS 3rd edition basic set. For Interstellar Wars, this is at minimum the GURPS basic set characters, but you will probably want to grab GURPS basic set campaigns too. Beyond that, it's really get going, you will need the relevant editions of low-tech, high-tech, ultra-tech, vehicles and space. For Traveller Hero, you need books 1 and 2 of the Traveller Hero core, plus the 5th edition hero system, and then you're set. And finally, for Classic Traveller, during the Interregnum, the classic books and the classic supplements are the volumes to grab, although there are plenty of alternative options currently available to get hold of the content that they contain. They do remain handy books to have on hand, though. Of the 3 non-Traveller system iterations of Traveller covered here, only GURPS Traveller comes close to capturing classic play for me. Traveller Hero is too overly complicated, and Traveller D20 falls foul of the power escalation of most level games. Traveller, for me at least, has never been about superheroic characters embarking on epic, lowercase, not the acronym, quests to save the galaxy, but about sometimes heroic folk doing their best to scratch an extraordinary living in a very varied and often hostile setting. all three games lose that feeling to one degree or another, particularly the emphasis that it's a big bad universe out there that Traveller proper lays down from character generation on. From a rules perspective, and this isn't to be taken as a negative critique of the systems in and of themselves, none of them fit Traveller to an equal or greater extent than Classic, Mega Traveller, New Era, T4, T5 and Mongoose editions of the game itself. Valiant efforts all, and they will have their fans, but they all lack something of the core spirit of the game, which ultimately underpins the charted space setting. This is absolutely not to say that the supporting material for the games, particularly those released for GURPS Traveller and T20, are not excellent, because most of them are. Virtually all of them are usable with any Traveller edition, and no Traveller referee should be disappointed should they add them to their reference library, especially GURPS Traveller Far Trader, which provides rules that you can use to draw all sorts of interesting coloured lines over your sector maps. Love, hate, or be indifferent to the Interregnum iterations of Traveller, the whole period served one greater purpose: to keep Traveller alive during a relatively difficult period of its history. For much of the Interregnum span, the only official Traveller rules available were reprints of Classic, so these alternative games gave platforms for designers to create new supporting materials. Without this, the coven of chroniclers we currently have supporting the Traveller game into the 21st century would have had very little to build from, and the further efforts of far future enterprises, both in Mark Miller's construction of the 5th edition and the assembling of GDW games and materials from third parties that supported them back in the day to make them available to new and old players alike, may not have been possible. Much of the traffic on role-playing these days, as it has always been, revolves around Dungeons & Dragons, and what whichever corporation pulls that game's strings is or is not doing at any given time. It's important to remember that Dungeons & Dragons is not the role-playing game industry. Yes, of course, it is the major chunk of it, but it is far from unique in the field. Beyond the shores of D&D and its faceless corporate masters lie many, many games that help to build the industry from its early roots, and many smaller companies that, more than any large shiny corporate game, rely absolutely on the support of their games' fan bases. The Interregnum is a testament to this, during a period when the primary mover of the role-playing game industry was becoming increasingly more faceless and corporate. A handful of small companies and talented individuals took one of the hobby's oldest proponents and kept its spirits alive. To all of those, living and unfortunately no longer with us, thank you.